Hi, I'm Dr. Tiffany Rao, and I'm going to present to you the first of 3 webinars in a series called Social Emotional Coaching. Specifically, I'm going to be talking about social emotional coaching in the classroom, and this is intended for teachers. This first webinar is called Social Emotional Coaching. It starts with you. I'll talk more about what that means in a moment. The second webinar is on co-regulation and SEL focused teaching habits. And the third webinar is enacting the role of SEL coach in the classroom. So in this webinar, I will discuss how effective SEL coaching really starts with you, the teacher, and teachers' own social emotional competence, how to assess your competence, and how to strengthen it. I'm going to share the QR code. So if you would like to access these slides and refer back to them later, you are welcome to do that. I will be sharing a few links here and there, so that might be useful to you. While you're doing that, I'm going to talk about how I developed this model of SEL coaching. First of all, I reviewed existing work on emotion coaching that was geared toward parents. I consulted a lot of work from the Gottman Institute, as well as other sources that I have cited throughout the series, all of which I have integrated and adapted to be more applicable to the teacher-student interaction and within the context of schools and classrooms. I have also consulted the work from CASEL.org. That's the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning. It is a leading source of research and professional development for social emotional learning in schools. And I have integrated my own experiences and examples of doing this work, primarily with students with disabilities throughout my years as a teacher and a specialist. And although special education is my area of expertise, SEL coaching is applicable for all types of teachers and students. So what is social emotional coaching? It is an intentional and interactional teaching practice based on consistent application of the principles of emotion coaching in order to improve students' social and emotional competencies. So a little bit about me. First of all, I am not a therapist. I am a consumer of therapy. I consume therapist-related content and literature, psychology literature, and principles of self-growth. I have a PhD in education with an emphasis in special education. I taught in the K through 12 settings for 11 years before coming here to teach in the Department of Special Education at Cal State Fullerton. I have a bachelor's degree in psychology, which of course does not qualify me to teach psychology or play therapist, and that is not what I'm trying to do. But I mention it because it has played a significant role in shaping the lens through which I view teaching and child development, and it has helped shape the framework from which I approach teaching and how I teach others to teach. I am going to talk today about issues such as emotion regulation, the polyvagal theory, subconscious beliefs that we have about the expression of emotions, and how these ideas impact our work with young people. And I'm going to facilitate some prompts in which I ask you to self-reflect and recall the types of messages that you received when you were young, and when you were still learning how to manage your emotional responses and your social interactions. I believe it's important to do this in order to gain self-awareness and challenge and disrupt any biases that we may have that, when unchecked, can lead to ineffective or even harmful practices in our work with the young people we serve. I believe you will gain insights from this webinar that are helpful to your own SEL and make you more effective as a teacher. And I hope that you find it fun, interesting, and relevant. All right, so if you experience any distress So if any part of this webinar leaves you feeling uncomfortable or raw or feeling like you need to talk to someone, please reach out to a qualified professional. If you are a Cal State Fullerton student, we have a wonderful resource you can access at compass.fullerton.edu, which can connect you to mental health support as well as several other types of possible support depending on your needs. And if you are not a Cal State Fullerton student and would like to speak to someone, you can dial 211 on your phone or go to 211.org to speak with a caring professional. All right, so what is a coach? The Cambridge English Dictionary defines a coach as someone whose job is to teach people to improve at a sport, skill, or school subject, versus teaching is focused on the acquisition of new knowledge and skills. Now, we know it's a whole lot more than that, but I just want to make a distinction as to why I'm calling this coaching. Coaching is focused on refining and developing knowledge and skills. We are never finished learning new social emotional competencies and skills. We are never finished getting better at it. Even you as an adult, you might feel like I've got it pretty well together, but let's say we put you in a completely new environment. Let's say, for example, you move to a different state or city and you go into an entirely new district that has different norms and a different kind of work culture and different values. You're not exactly sure how the teachers interact with each other. You were really great at that at your first district. Now you're going to have to learn kind of all over again how to navigate that new work environment and be good at it like you were before. You might be pretty good at it to begin with, but you'll still need to grow. So this is from CASEL.org, and this is this illustrates the 5 areas of social emotional competency, which is self-management, self-awareness, responsible decision-making, relationship skills, and social awareness. And here are those competencies in more detail. And I'm not going to spend time on this because this series of webinars, I sort of assume that you're somewhat familiar with this. We're going to move on to a little bit more of an advanced place than this, but this is a really great resource to keep on hand. And so, like I was giving the example before, if you were to switch jobs, you would probably need to learn some new relationship skills, new social awareness. You might need to learn new decision-making skills because they do things differently. And it's the same for our students. We would never expect our students to master social emotional learning by the time they finish 12th grade. They are still going to be learning. So that's why I think that the title of coach is very appropriate here, because we are coaching them in their growth and their refinement of skills rather than helping them master a set of skills. All right, so characteristics of effective SEL coaches. This comes from the concept and practice that I mentioned earlier on emotion coaching with parents. This is specifically from the Gottman Institute, which I have used as a resource and revised here for classroom application. As I mentioned before, I think I mentioned this, the first 2 webinars are foundational. This one, SEL coaching, it starts with you, and the next one, co-regulation and SEL focused teaching habits. Those are foundational to the third one, enacting the role of SEL coach. Please don't skip them because they are important in order to be effective at coaching. In the last webinar, I will go over a step-by-step approach to SEL coaching and give examples of exactly how it would play out in a classroom. So, characteristics of effective coaches. Number 1, they stay vigilant of emotions in themselves and their students, even when they are at a low intensity. So this covers, I've put in parentheses, self-awareness and social awareness. I mention which SEL competencies are really addressed in each of these characteristics. Number two, good SEL coaches use emotional moments as an opportunity to connect and teach effective regulation instead of shaming a student for emotional outbursts. That relates back to self-management, relationship skills, and responsible decision-making. Number three, they can see things from a student's perspective and validate how the student feels. So that requires social awareness and relationship skills. Number four, when a student expresses emotions, they verbally label them. The adult can verbally label them for the young person or the child. That requires self-awareness and social awareness. And then number five, they problem solve with the student, set limits, discuss goals, and find strategies to deal with the situation that caused the negative emotion. That requires relationship skills and responsible decision-making. Now, these are 5 characteristics. As I just mentioned, I'm going to go through a step-by-step plan in the final webinar. It is 5 steps. This is different from the 5 steps. This is just the 5 characteristics of an effective coach. So let's talk about the research that is on SEL competence in teachers. Teachers who were mandated to teach social emotional learning but did not cultivate their own practice actually were found to have worsened their students' SEL skills, while teachers who committed to their own SEL growth improved not only their own well-being, but also the social, emotional, and academic development of their students. That research came from the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence. Other research from Aspen's Institute on social, emotional, and academic development indicated that students learn SEL skills better when educators can effectively model these skills. That really comes as no surprise, but I think it's important to note anyway. And then from the Harvard Grad School of Education, from Jones, teacher social emotional competence influences the quality of student-teacher relationships, classroom management, and overall school climate. I have a little bit more research to share with you on a couple of more slides. We also know that student achievement increases in calm classrooms. Where they feel safe, they make greater academic gains. That calm consistency starts with teachers who have good social emotional competence. And this is from Will 2017. This is a direct quote because I really liked it. The primary way children learn social emotional skills is through being exposed to adult behavior. This was from Patricia Jennings, who's an associate professor of education in Virginia and studies teacher stress and the social emotional context in the classroom. If a teacher doesn't have a level of social emotional competence to model the kinds of behaviors that they are hoping students will adopt, then he or she is sending mixed messages. So in other words, you don't want to be a phony. It's very important to teach with authenticity, be able to walk the walk and talk the talk. And we are the social emotional role models in the classroom. So it all comes down to mirror neurons, which I find so fascinating. This is from Brain Science. All of us have these socially oriented mirror neurons in our brains that function to replicate and make sense of the actions of others. These neurons also play a role in understanding and empathizing with others' emotions. A teacher's social and emotional state can set the stage for how students feel and interact with each other, even if the teacher is not fully aware of that. Having good self-awareness and emotional regulation on a consistent basis can help your students to develop the same competencies. So people with really strong mirror neurons often have strong empathy for others. They can almost feel what other people are feeling, even without that person saying very much. They're very good at just picking up on body language and on other cues that they might not even be aware of that tell them the emotional state of someone else. In other words, you cannot build student social emotional competence without becoming an emotionally mature teacher. So I am going to ask a series of self-reflection questions. And like I mentioned earlier, I recommend you pause this webinar after each question, give yourself some time to think about the question. And then I would either talk out loud about your response or write your responses out on paper. Or if you have a partner with you that's interested in this subject as well, it could be kind of fun to discuss them with a partner. But that will lead to greater self-growth rather than just kind of listening to each question and thinking about it inside your head and then going on to the next one. So number one, how were you brought up in the context of SEL? Now, that's a very broad, kind of vague question. So maybe that's more of an opening question, and you can reflect on the next ones. Did you have adult models with strong social emotional skills? Was one or more adults in your life prone to dysregulation or emotional immaturity? And how do you think that impacted your social emotional development? So think about that, maybe write out a response or talk about it while you pause this webinar and then come back for the next ones. I also want you to think about what messages did you receive when you expressed big emotions or poor social skills. All children do this because they're not fully developed people yet. So all children are going to have times when they are expressing these big emotions through what might look like a tantrum or whatnot, or they take some kid's ball on the playground without asking nicely because they are learning. So we all did this. So think about, were the messages you received as a child compassionate and direct, or were they more abrupt, critical, shaming, or punishing, or something else? Now, let me say really quick, you might feel like it was in between. You might feel like, well, yeah, my parents weren't like always, compassionate or directly teaching me these things. I don't know that a lot of parents were, to be honest, but they weren't like, shaming or overly critical. And so that's okay too. I'm not trying to make this a binary choice. You can have experienced something in between, and you might come around to thinking, well, it was good enough. And I'm going to talk more about that in a moment, but just write about what you remember your experience being. Were you punished, ignored? Were you given space? Were you given too much space or too little space? And were you taught skills? Did you feel connected to your parent or parents or your caregiver or caregivers in a positive way, even when they corrected your behavior? And did you feel safe to express your feelings? Did you feel safe to make mistakes? So connecting messages may have sounded like, it looks like you might be getting tired. Do you want to come rest next to dad for a few minutes? Or, we can't grab toys away from our friends like that. Let's try a different way. Or, we don't throw sand, but here's a ball instead. If you keep throwing sand, we'll have to leave because it gets in people's eyes. So those are examples of messages that set a boundary, but do not disrupt the connection that the caregiver has with the child. Disconnecting messages may have sounded like, I guess we'll have to leave the party without cake because you can't behave yourself. You should know better by now. Don't be so sensitive. You are acting like such a brat. Stop acting like a baby or a big boy, or you should be ashamed of yourself. Now, these are common. Probably everyone's heard them somewhere or other when they were growing up, and maybe you've even used them yourself. I don't want anyone to, go down into a spiral of feeling bad because maybe you've used some of these messages and maybe you don't see the problem with them either. And if it's once in a while we kind of use a really critical message, our kids are going to be okay. But some of these messages can really harm kids, especially kids who are more sensitive or at a more sensitive place in their lives. So the first one, I guess we'll have to leave the party without cake because you can't behave yourself. That's a big deal, right? That's a really big deal. I'm not saying you should never leave a party. I'm not saying you should, give a screaming child cake, but the message is you're not good enough to be at this party. You should know better by now. I'm going to refute that one because we do not finish growing our brains until age 25. Our brains are still in development until age 25. So to say to a young child, you should know better by now, is really not accurate. There are times in their lives where they might seem very competent and very mature, but maturing and growing your brain is kind of cyclical, and it's like 2 steps forward, 2 steps back sometimes. Don't be so sensitive. That's one that really stings a lot of kids. Or you're acting like such a brat. That's kind of name calling. You're a big boy. Again, that goes back to we need to just honor that our kids don't know everything yet, or you should be ashamed of yourself. There really is nothing good that comes from shaming. So we definitely want to stay away from that. But like I said, you might feel like it was somewhere in between. You might think, well, I heard both types of messages. Or sometimes my parents did say I was acting like a brat, and I probably was, right? Maybe you're thinking that. Or you're thinking, I don't know, they were there when I needed them, but they also gave me a lot of space. So good enough parenting is it allows for mistakes. It's actually been kind of argued to be the best form of parenting that has the best outcomes for children. It means not perfect. It allows for mistakes in parenting, apologies, repairs. When you're not perfect, that's when you get to be vulnerable and show your child that you make mistakes too, and that your relationship is important to them, and you're going to apologize when you have harmed them unintentionally by losing your temper or being in too much of a rush when they wanted to tell you their story, whatever it was. So it's kind of like providing a simple, nutritious meal to keep your child fed rather than this Pinterest-worthy bento box with flour cut out fruits and cheeses every day in their lunch, right? It is good enough. The primary tools of good enough parenting are empathy, conscious reflection, and maturity. So if you want to learn more about that, I put a QR code as well as the link because I think it's really interesting. All right, and a few more questions for self-reflection. I want you to think about your teachers. Do you remember any of your teachers losing their temper? How did that impact you? I can remember some of my teachers losing their temper. I'm not sure it had, any kind of scarring effect on me, but I definitely remember it was uncomfortable, and often it felt unfair because they were just in a really bad mood and sort of taking it out on the whole class, even though maybe at least half of us were behaving. And think about, what were your favorite teachers like, and what did you learn from them? Who were your social emotional role models? Think of someone at any point in your life, it could have been as an adult, who helped you learn to become a better version of yourself. How did they do that? Did they seem to have strong or weak social emotional learning skills? Probably strong, but maybe they helped you see what you didn't want to do. But think about that person for a little while and how they helped, probably through modeling. You are that person for yourself now. How do you do it? I'm going to go over 3 pieces in more detail right now. Number 1, self-awareness. Are there old wounds or subconscious beliefs or insecurities that might be creeping into your work with students? Number 2, self-compassion. You're going to start replacing any inner voices of self-judgment with voices of self-compassion. I will give you examples of how to do all of that. And then social emotional self-assessment and action. So let's get into that. Teacher self-awareness. There are some common teacher insecurities that I want to talk about. The common message that teachers get is that student behavior is a reflection of your competency as a teacher. That's a problematic message, in my opinion, because that's what sets teachers sometimes into this need to control. If they are looking at student behavior, which is really much more complex to solely attach to the teacher's responsibility, that's a lot to take on. And we can become very controlling because we don't want it to reflect poorly on us. I'm not saying that teachers have no responsibility for student behavior, because certainly we already know there are a lot of things that we can do to encourage positive behavior and discourage negative behavior. And when we do those things, they often work, sometimes not as well as we want, but if we didn't do any of them, then the class would be running wild. So we can put in all kinds of research-based, excellent strategies and practices, but will your class be perfectly behaved? No, because like I said, behavior is much more complex than that. It will improve the behavior overall in your classroom, but we're never going to get to perfection. Now, you might overhear statements from other teachers that support this assumption that student behavior is a reflection of teacher competency. The messages you might hear from other teachers talking about other teachers is, he lets his class run wild. She has no control over her students. He doesn't know how to discipline. That would never happen in my class because I would not allow it. Now, when we hear these messages, even if they are not directed at us, the message is loud and clear that we need to have control over our students' behaviors, or we're going to be the next ones talked negatively about. And we have such an innate fear of social banishment that we really step up and align ourselves with those social expectations. I'm going to give you some alternative affirmations to remind yourself that will hopefully help to counteract these messages that you probably will hear if you haven't already. So here those are. Here are alternative beliefs that lead to teacher empowerment. So like I said, these are statements that lead to teacher insecurities. These are beliefs that you can adopt that will lead to teacher empowerment. So for one thing, it's good to remember that student behavior is complex and it reflects the student's stage of emotional development and their current level of SEL competency. You can counter those negative messages with affirmations such as, my student is having a hard time and I am here to help her through it. Another one that I like is, my student is having a hard time not giving me a hard time. My students' brains are still developing and I am here to support their development in a healthy way. My students are safe to express their big feelings with me. I am sticking with my plan that's based on research and best practices, and staying calm and validating my students is not the same as being a pushover. So if you think back to those reflective questions that I asked, and maybe some difficult memories of when you had poor behavior, along with some messages that you might be overhearing from other teachers, we sort of collect these messages, these experiences, and if we don't reflect on them, then they come out in our practice, and we tend to perpetuate the same things. That's why I'm asking you to do this work. More beliefs that lead to teacher empowerment. And I love affirmations. I love to read things like this on a regular basis. It really seems to help put me in a good mindset. So you could definitely print these out or, sort of copy and paste them maybe into your phone or onto your laptop and open them up every day before class and just read 2 or 3 a day. That's how I use affirmations. And you can use affirmations for a whole lot of different goals that you might have. So other teachers may not see the big picture, and that's okay. I am confident in the approach I take. I wish I had this one back when I was a very young teacher, because I was really susceptible to what other people thought. And this, I think, would have been very empowering to 23-year-old me. I can set clear boundaries with my students without causing them harm. I can teach my students better coping skills while maintaining our connection. I can be a role model to other teachers through my actions. My approach to supporting students is not a quick fix, but it is worth the time and effort. I choose to respond from a place of calm rather than a place of anger or anxiety. I treat my students with respect, even when it is challenging to do so, because that is my standard. I will not allow my emotions to derail along with the students. I will maintain emotional control and calmness so that I can model emotional regulation. So more disconnecting beliefs about young people's big feelings and behaviors. Adults can have a tendency to dismiss, criticize, or trivialize children's feelings. These are common responses from adults who are frustrated or maybe find a child's emotions offensive. Again, you want to do that reflection to think about why you find these behaviors or emotions offensive. I know they can definitely be frustrating, though. And we tend to think that by maybe downplaying the emotion, it will help them move on, but it can actually make things worse. So messages or statements that you might hear or beliefs that you might hear in your own head is, it's no big deal, you're fine, too bad, so sad, you get what you get and you don't throw a fit, stop crying, he's 8 years old, he should know better by now, or he's doing this on purpose, it's manipulative. Now, I will admit, I have used some of these statements before. I have said, you get what you get and you don't throw a fit. I've said, you're okay. And we're trying to reassure the child that they are okay. And that's sometimes fine. Sometimes that's exactly what they need. But let's take, for example, a child falls and they come to you and you check them, they're not bleeding, they don't even have a scrape, but they are crying. And often we want to say, walk it off, you're fine, go back and play, you're fine. And we're sort of trying to help them move on and reassure them that they are fine. But the child is scared and they don't know if they're fine and they don't feel fine. So before we go to, hey, I know you're fine, even though you don't know you're fine, a better approach is to validate. Oh my gosh, you really took a big fall. Are you hurt? Oh, I bet that was scary. I bet that would have scared me. Oh, well, you know what? I can tell that you don't have any blood. You don't have any scrapes. You are physically okay. But do you want to sit with me until you don't feel so scared anymore? You want to just sit by me? Okay, so takes maybe 30 extra seconds than a quick sentence like these messages, but it really helps connect you to the child more. And it's going to help them recognize that what they're feeling is understandable. If we dismiss the emotion too quickly, then it can lead to, first of all, us making an assumption and acting accordingly, missing the real issue. Let me go back to this last one. He's doing this on purpose. It's manipulative. That's an assumption. It might be true, but we don't really know until we've looked more closely at the behavior and the function behind the behavior. So if we just act on our assumption, we might miss the real issue and not come up with as effective of an approach and a solution as we could. It can also lead to children feeling unheard, self-distrust, like the example I just gave. A child falls and we tell them they're fine. They are learning to not trust their own feelings. They might internalize that the expression of emotions is wrong. Like some of us adults may have internalized that as well. And now we're working with children, and so we assume the same. They can have low self-worth and shame over time, and suppression of emotions, which can later manifest as anxiety or depression, inability to focus, increase in behavior problems, or projection of pain onto others. So studies show that children with emotion dismissing adults and caregivers tend to have more negative emotions and more behavior problems. Now, I really want to stress, I'm not talking about a once in a while, you said too bad, so sad, or whatever it is. I'm talking about a pattern of this when this becomes the norm message that is delivered in a classroom or in a home, then these are the risks that you're up against. But alternative beliefs, alternative to the messages that I just shared, these are more connection focused. Your connection with your students is very, very important. And so these are more connection focused beliefs that you could adopt. Instead of saying this is no big deal, you might think in your head, well, this is a big deal for her. I wouldn't think that it's a big deal, but then again, I'm a full grown adult with bills to pay. But for her, this is a big deal. I know she's fine, but she may not feel fine. I can take a minute to let her know I'm here for her. His tears tell me he's hurting. So even though he might not have any scratches or scrapes or bruises or bleeding, he's crying, and that tells us that at least inside we know that he's hurting. Or her behavior tells me she wants attention. It's natural to want attention. He is trying to get a need met. She may be 15 years old, but her brain won't be fully developed until age 25. And everyone is doing the best they can with the tools they have. When you approach problem solving a child's behavior issues from these beliefs, you are going to have a much more effective outcome. We know that emotional validation leads to a greater sense of self and identity, greater self-awareness, more effective regulation of emotions, feeling supported, trust building, feeling safe enough to be honest, and de-intensifying overwhelming emotions. And that really covers the whole lifespan. When we experience emotional validation from either a parent or a caregiver or a partner or a friend, we feel better, and it leads to better mental health. All right, I'm about to share with you the polyvagal theory, but let me explain a little background before we get into it. The polyvagal theory is, in oversimplified terms here, about fight or flight, or actually fight, flight, or freeze. It's the theory that our physiological state determines different types of our behaviors. So if we're in a state of hyperarousal, anxiety, or anger, we in turn act out of that state of anxiety or anger with a fight or flight response. Or if we feel another level of hyperarousal like shame or depression, we may go into a freeze mode. But if we are in a state of calm and feeling safe, then we are in a better state to learn and connect with each other and have positive social interactions. But the polyvagal theory is just that. It is a theory. It is unproven. Critics say that it is oversimplified and makes too many hypothetical leaps. However, supporters of the theory assert that it can be a useful tool in understanding our emotional responses to stress. So keeping all of that in mind, I don't want to pretend that this theory is bigger than it is. It is currently an unproven theory, but one that many people find useful. And I find it particularly useful here when we're thinking about how we respond to the stress of student behaviors and how our students in turn respond to stress. So here is the polyvagal chart. So down here in the green, that is when we are feeling safe, we feel connected, we feel oriented. And in this state of social engagement, that is when we're calm, we're settled, we're grounded, we might be curious and open to learning, we feel compassionate, we feel mindful in the present. But something stressful happens, and now we are feeling frustration or worry or concern, or it might escalate to anxiety, anger, fear, panic, or rage. This is over here, fight. The more angry feelings leads to movement toward flight, and the more fear-based feelings leads to movement toward flight. So we might argue. If we're really angry, we might start arguing, or maybe kids might even start physically fighting. Or we're scared, we want to just shut down. We want to escape. You might see this in a child who is scared of math because they've had so many bad experiences with math and they just shut down. Okay, they're in that this yellow sympathetic hyperarousal state. And then you keep going up to a feeling of helplessness or depression or shame or hopelessness, feeling trapped. This is where we're looking at collapse, immobility, conservation of energy. So think about if you are teaching from a place of social engagement, even once your kids go up here, or even when they're up here, you're able to stay down here. You're basically inviting them to come back to a place of safety and connection. That's your best bet. But if your students' behaviors start getting into hyperarousal, and I don't even mean always just anger or anxiety, but hyperactivity, overwhelm, overexcited, right? To where they're no longer in the green. And then you in turn start to get, oh my gosh, it's out of control. My colleagues are going to judge me that I don't have control. I need to get control over this classroom, right? Because of those underlying beliefs that you have. And you go into here. Now, where's the social emotional model here? Your kids need a model very, very much. And so you don't want to both be in that teacher-student interaction in the yellow or the red together. So it's very important. You will see teachers who seem to always be coming from this place of anxious or angry control. And you look at their students, and their students might be very well behaved, but are they in the green or are they in the red? Are they in a freeze mode? And they are behaving out of fear. out of fear of shame, out of sort of a hopelessness or just dissociation. So if you see these teachers that teach from this yellow place, sometimes if you're teaching from the green, they incorrectly view that as you're weak, you don't have control over your students, you've got to get better control. I wouldn't put up with that in my class. So that's where those alternative beliefs are very helpful to keep you confident in what you are doing. All right. So self-awareness, let me just kind of wrap that up. Oh, one other thing I forgot that I wanted to say. I'm not saying you cannot be human, okay? But this is where self-awareness is so important. You will for sure feel anxiety. You'll feel overwhelmed because the classroom's so noisy, or this kid just ran out the door and now you got to figure something out, right? It's stressful. So you will feel hyper aroused at times throughout the day. Self-awareness is so important in the moment so that you can recognize, oh my gosh, I feel very irritated right now, and I need to take some deep breaths, or I need to go get a drink of water, or I need to excuse myself from the bathroom if you have somebody who can cover your class, so that I can just get 5 minutes of deep breathing and bring myself closer back down to the green. I am going to talk a lot more about this in the next webinar, but these are actually excellent opportunities to model social emotional regulation to your students. So just like I said with good enough parenting, how it's okay for parents to make mistakes, it's the same thing. You can and should practice good enough teaching. You do not need to be perfect and always in this Zen green state. It's not natural. But if you can use those opportunities as a time to model and say, hey, whoa, you guys, it's so loud in here and it's making me feel kind of anxious. I'm going to take some deep breaths right now to get myself to a calmer state. And then you start modeling deep breaths, and you might find that your students just get right in line with you, or at least some of them, and start taking deep breaths as well. Okay, now let's move on to teacher self-compassion. So self-compassion is recognizing that something is really hard and asking, how can I comfort and care for myself right now? Instead of judging and criticizing yourself, self-compassion means you use kindness and understanding toward yourself. Self-kindness versus self-judgment. So if you notice that you are kind of critical of yourself, or you tend to self-judge, one point of reflection that you can take on that is, whose voice is this? Do I recognize this voice from my childhood? Because if you do, that's one way that you can detach and realize that was a voice I learned and it is no longer serving me. Now, you might have that voice if you are a natural perfectionist and it really just is something that you have developed. So either way, I encourage you to challenge any voice of self-judgment that you have, or any critical voice that you have telling you yourself that I wasn't good enough, I screwed up, I'm an imposter. And instead, try speaking to yourself with all the support and loving kindness that you would with a child or a good friend or someone you love. So this bottom part here comes from the website, which I believe I have on the next slide, selfcompassion.org. And that comes from Kristen Neff, who really is like the self-compassion guru. It's a great website, and she even has things specific to self-compassion for teachers. So here is an example of something that she wrote there that you might apply. You could either say something like this to yourself or write yourself sort of a letter of self-compassion. So let's say you had a really tough day and you yelled at the kids and you feel just really bad about it, okay? I'm so sorry you had a rough day. This is you talking to yourself. Even though you may have said some things to students you wish you hadn't, it's okay. All teachers do that once in a while, but the students survive and so will you. I know you care so much about your students and want them to be successful. Teaching is one of the most challenging jobs out there, and you're doing the best you can. So here is that website. If you want to look at more ways to show self-compassion, then you can check out the website, selfcompassion.org, on that QR code. And here are just a few of the ideas. Keep a self-compassion journal, maybe where you write letters to yourself like I just read. A compassionate self-squeeze, I really like that one. That's just basically when you give yourself a hug, and you can sort of do it like if your arms are folded and you're even in public, you can just kind of give yourself a little squeeze, maybe breathe in, breathe out, and it can just help to remind yourself that you're there for yourself. Another one is deep breaths, but as you breathe in, tell yourself compassion for me. And then as you breathe out, you're thinking of compassion for the other person that you're interacting with. Compassion for me, compassion for this other person. And that's a great way to really reset. And so, like I said, you can visit that website. There are 18 guided meditations and exercises there that are all free. There are also, I think, workshops that you can pay for, but there's a lot of really great free materials on there. All right. And that brings me now to teacher, SEL, self-assessment, and action. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is that you can assess your social emotional competencies at this link. This comes from CASEL. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time going over it because you can access it. And I do recommend, again, you pause, open this up, and then give yourself an assessment. It's a really great, fairly quick, I think it would take you maybe 10 minutes, self-assessment on each of those competencies: self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, etc. And once you've done that assessment, here are some of the reflection questions that they ask, which is available at this link right up here. So some of the questions at CASEL for reflection is: how do your strengths affect your interactions with students? What competencies do your strengths relate to? What helps you? Which of your strengths help you achieve personal and professional goals? What areas were weaker? How might strengthening these areas benefit your students? What areas of weakness may at times hinder your progress or professional goals? And then you develop a strategy to strengthen one or two areas of weakness. What kinds of learning experiences and supports can help address your areas of weakness? And how can you stay motivated and hold yourself accountable to keep growing and reflecting on your competencies? All right. So that concludes this webinar. The next webinar, as I mentioned earlier, is titled Co-Regulation and SEL-Focused Teaching Habits. I'm going to give you a lot of different ideas for routines and activities that you can integrate into your class, many of which require little to no preparation. And also I'm going to talk a lot about co-regulation, specifically co-regulation at all stages of childhood through young adulthood. Co-regulation originated in early childhood, but it is really gaining traction across the whole span of childhood through young adulthood. So I'll give you some specific ways on how to co-regulate, what that means, how to do it at different stages. And then, of course, the final webinar is enacting the role of social emotional coach. And here are the references that I have included. Thank you so much for joining me, and I hope that you will check out the next one.